The Crethon Dominion had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and nobody dared to question their authority. Because when the Crethon gave orders, the entire galaxy obeyed without hesitation, and those who refused were crushed so completely that their names became warnings whispered in the darkness of space, and every species from the mighty Palaxian Empire to the smallest colony worlds had learned this lesson through blood and fire. Admiral Marcus Blake stood on the bridge of the USS Defiance and read the message that had just arrived from the Crethon homeworld, and his jaw tightened as the words appeared on the holographic display in front of him, because the message was simple and brutal in its clarity, and it demanded that all species surrender 30% of their resources immediately, or face total destruction, and they had exactly 72 hours to comply. Captain Lauren Hayes moved beside him, and her expression showed the same anger he felt burning in his chest because humanity had not crawled out of Earth's gravity well and crossed the vast emptiness between stars just to become slaves to alien tyrants. And she looked at him with those sharp green eyes that had seen too many battles and asked what they were going to do about this ultimatum. Marcus turned to look at his crew and saw Lieutenant Jack Morrison at the weapons console, and Commander Nina Wells handling communications, and young Ensign Kyle Bennett at navigation, and all of them were watching him with a mixture of fear and determination because they knew what was coming next, and they knew that whatever decision he made would change everything for humanity. Forever. The thing about humans was that they were new to the galactic stage and had only made first contact with alien life 200 years ago, and in that short time, they had built a respectable collection of colony worlds and a fleet of 300 warships, but compared to the ancient empires, they were nothing more than children playing with toys, and the Crethon Dominion commanded thousands of vessels, each one capable of destroying planets. Nina spoke up from her station and reported that every other species in their sector had already agreed to pay the tribute, and the Vexlari had started loading their ships with resources, and the Palaxians had transmitted their acceptance within an hour of receiving the demand, and 3 smaller civilizations had offered their territory to the Crethon as staging grounds, just to prove their loyalty and avoid punishment. Marcus pulled up the strategic map and studied the layout of human-controlled space and saw 17 star systems with 42 colony worlds scattered across them, and Earth itself sitting at the heart of it all, with 8 billion people who had no idea that their entire future was being decided right now on the bridge of a warship at the edge of explored space. He ordered Nina to open a channel to Fleet Command back on Earth, and within moments the weathered face of Admiral Richard Cole appeared on the display, and behind him stood the Joint Chiefs of Earth's unified military, all of them looking grim, because they had received the same ultimatum and were waiting for recommendations from their field commanders. Richard got straight to the point and explained that the president wanted their assessment within the hour, and that the civilian government was split down the middle, with half wanting to negotiate and buy time while the other half wanted to tell the Crethon exactly where they could stick their demands, and Richard asked Marcus for his honest opinion about what humanity should do. Marcus thought about all the history lessons he had learned as a young officer at the academy, and remembered reading about every time in human history when a powerful bully had demanded submission, and how sometimes people had surrendered and lived as slaves, and how other times people had fought back even when the odds were impossible, and how those moments of defiance had shaped everything that came after. He told Richard that the Crethon were bullies, and that bullies only understood one language, and that language was force. And he said that humanity needed to make the Dominion regret ever pointing their weapons at Earth, and he could see the shock on the faces of the Joint Chiefs, because what he was suggesting was essentially a declaration of war against the most powerful military force in the known galaxy. General Patricia Stone leaned forward and asked if he was seriously proposing that humanity fight the Crethon, and Marcus nodded and explained that the Dominion had not fought a real war in over 800 years, because every species they encountered simply surrendered without firing a shot, and that made them complacent and predictable and possibly vulnerable if someone was crazy enough to actually fight back. The meeting ended, and Marcus knew that the next few hours would determine everything, because the politicians on Earth would argue and debate and run computer simulations, and eventually they would have to make a choice between freedom and survival. And he hoped they would choose correctly, because if they surrendered now, humanity would never be free again. 4 hours later, President Helen Carter appeared on every screen across human-controlled space, and she was a former fighter pilot who had flown combat missions before entering politics, and she looked directly into the camera and said that humanity would not submit and would not surrender and would not become slaves no matter how powerful the Crethon claimed to be. And she told the Dominion that humanity chose freedom. The reaction from the other species was immediate and predictable, and the Vexlari ambassador sent a private message expressing admiration for humanity's courage and sorrow for their inevitable extinction, and the Palaxians cut all diplomatic ties because they did not want to be associated with a doomed species, and 3 neighboring civilizations hastily offered their space to the Crethon fleet as a way to prove they were loyal and obedient. Marcus watched the diplomatic channels light up with panicked messages and carefully worded condolences, and he understood that the other species were not heartless. They had simply learned through millennia of brutal experience that defying the Dominion meant death, and they genuinely believed humanity would be extinct within weeks. Nina reported that Fleet Command was sending orders for all human warships to converge on the Titan Nebula, which was a massive cloud of gas and debris at the edge of human space, and it was directly on the route any Dominion fleet would take to reach Earth. And Marcus understood immediately that if humanity was going to make a stand, that was where it would happen. He ordered the helmsman to set course at maximum speed, and the Defiance's engines flared bright, and the flagship began moving toward its destiny. And across human space, 300 other warships did the same, because they had all received the same orders and they were all converging on a single point like an arrow aimed at the heart of tyranny. Jack pulled up new intelligence from scout ships and reported that the Dominion was sending their subjugation fleet, which consisted of 75 capital ships and 300 support vessels. And worst of all, they were sending the Hammer of Obedience, which was their legendary flagship commanded by war leader Crethix himself. Lauren's face went pale because everyone in the fleet had heard stories about the Hammer, and how it had broken the backs of a dozen civilizations, and how its arrival in a star system was synonymous with unconditional surrender, and the ship was 5 miles long and carried enough firepower to crack a planet in half. Marcus turned to address his crew and told them they were about to do something no species had done in 8 centuries. And they were going to teach the Dominion that some people bite back. And young Kyle asked how they were supposed to win against such overwhelming odds, and Marcus smiled and said the Dominion had forgotten what it was like to fight someone who refused to lose. He opened a channel to all 300 ships in the fleet and spoke clearly, so that every captain and every crew member could hear him, and he told them that in 36 hours they would face an enemy that had never known defeat, and that enemy expected them to run or surrender or die quietly. But he said humanity would do none of those things. He told them they would win, not because they were stronger, but because they had something the Dominion lost long ago, and that was the memory of what it meant to fight for something worth dying for. And he said humanity had not crossed the impossible distances between stars just to bow down to the first bully with a big enough stick. As the channel closed, Lauren asked quietly if he really believed they could win. And Marcus looked at her and thought about all the times in history when people had faced impossible odds and somehow found a way through, and he told her they were about to find out if human stubbornness was enough to change the galaxy. The Titan Nebula hung in space like a massive bruise against the darkness, and it was filled with swirling clouds of purple and crimson gas that glowed from the light of newborn stars and the radiation from dying neutron stars, and it was beautiful, in a deadly way because sensors barely worked inside the nebula, and navigation required constant adjustments to avoid the dense pockets of debris that could tear a ship apart. Marcus stood on the bridge and studied the tactical map showing how the 300 human warships were positioning themselves throughout the nebula in 3 distinct layers like a trap waiting to be sprung, and he had spent the last 30 hours refining this plan with his best tactical officers. And now it was time to see if desperate cunning could overcome raw power. The first layer consisted of 40 fast attack cruisers and destroyers under the command of Admiral Gregory Nash aboard the USS Valiant, and their job was to hit hard and fast, and then fade back into the nebula, drawing the Dominion fleet deeper into the trap. And Gregory was an old friend who had served with Marcus for 20 years, and he understood the plan perfectly. The second layer was made up of 60 heavy cruisers and battleships commanded by Commodore Lisa Grant, and they were positioned in the densest parts of the nebula, where sensor interference was strongest, and they would wait in complete silence, with their power systems running at minimum levels until the perfect moment came to strike. The third layer was the main battle fleet centered around the Defiance and 15 other capital ships, and they would be the hammer that crushed the Dominion forces against the anvil once the trap was fully sprung, and Marcus knew that timing would be everything, because if any part of the plan failed, the entire human fleet would be destroyed. Jack looked up from his console and reported multiple hyperspace signatures appearing at the edge of the nebula, and his voice was tight with tension, because they all knew what was coming. And within seconds, the Dominion fleet materialized on their sensors like demons emerging from hell itself. 75 massive Crethon warships arranged in perfect assault formation, and each one bristled with weapons that could level cities, and their shields glowed with enough power to stop almost anything humanity could throw at them. And in the center of it all was the hammer of obedience dwarfing everything around it. Kyle whispered a quiet prayer because even through the sensor interference the readings were staggering, and the Dominion flagship was 5 miles of brutal angular architecture covered in weapons, and its shields alone probably had more power than the entire human fleet combined. Nina reported an incoming transmission from the hammer, and Marcus ordered her to put it on screen. And suddenly they were looking at war leader Crethix himself, and he was tall, even for a Crethon with 4 eyes, and a chitinous exoskeleton decorated with kill markings from 40 different conquered species. Crethix spoke in perfect English, though his accent was strange, and he introduced himself formally, and then said he had studied humanity during the journey here, and found them to be young and ambitious, and possessed of crude innovation, but unfortunately, they had chosen suicide by defying the Dominion. Marcus kept his face neutral and said humanity saw things differently, and Crethix seemed almost amused and pointed out that 300 primitive vessels could not possibly defeat the subjugation fleet, and he asked what madness possessed humans to even try. Marcus leaned forward and told him it was not madness but principle, and that humanity would not be slaves to anyone. And Crethix tasted the word principle like it was something strange and foreign, and then he said that human principle would cost them everything, because he would reduce the fleet to atoms and then proceed to Earth and boil the oceans and enslave any survivors. Marcus told him he was welcome to try, and the silence stretched out between them until Crethix's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter. And he said he liked Marcus, and that it was almost a shame they had to die. And then he gestured, and ordered his fleet to assume attack formation, and demonstrate why the galaxy obeyed. The transmission cut off, and Marcus immediately ordered all ships to battle stations, and told Nina to get him Admiral Nash on the line, and Gregory's grizzled face appeared and said they had seen everything, and the Dominion was moving in assault formation, nice and compact, just like they hoped. Marcus wished him good hunting, and the transmission ended. And then the first layer of human ships powered up from their hiding spots among the asteroids and gas clouds, and 40 destroyers and cruisers suddenly appeared on Dominion sensors like ghosts becoming real. The human ships opened fire, and hundreds of missiles streaked across the void, each one tipped with penetrator warheads designed to punch through shields, and most were intercepted by point defense lasers, but not all of them, and 3 Dominion cruisers staggered as explosions blossomed against their shields. The subjugation fleet responded exactly as Marcus predicted, and their capital ships moved to intercept, while lighter vessels broke formation to chase down the attackers, and it was a textbook response drilled into Dominion crews for centuries, but it was also exactly what the trap required. Lauren observed that the enemy was committing their screening forces and splitting their formation, and Marcus agreed, and said that bullies always acted this way, because they could not imagine anyone being truly dangerous, and they thought this was just the death throes of a defeated enemy. Admiral Nash's ships danced through the nebula, firing and dodging and leading the Dominion forces deeper and deeper into the densest parts of the gas clouds, and the enemy pursued eagerly because they smelled blood in the water and thought victory was assured. Jack counted down the time until the Dominion forces reached the kill zone, and Marcus watched as the enemy screening force pulled far ahead of their capital ships, spreading out to pursue multiple targets, and their formation became ragged and stretched thin, exactly as planned. When Jack reached 0, Marcus gave the order and told all second-layer ships to light them up, and suddenly 60 human battleships and heavy cruisers that had been sitting cold and undetectable for hours powered up simultaneously, and they were right in the middle of the Dominion screening force. The close-range firing was absolutely devastating because railgun rounds traveling at significant fractions of light speed tore through Dominion shields that had not fully powered up yet, and plasma torpedoes detonated in spectacular fireballs, and point defense lasers filled the space between ships with deadly light. 20 Dominion vessels died in the first 30 seconds and their hulls ruptured and spilled atmosphere and debris and bodies into the void, and Nina reported that the Anvil engagement was successful and the enemy screening force was in complete disarray. But the Dominion was not helpless because these were veteran crews who had subjugated entire civilizations, and they recovered quickly with capital ships accelerating forward while surviving screening vessels regrouped and their return fire began. Finding targets in the USS Stryker took a direct hit from an antimatter cannon and simply ceased to exist. Marcus ordered Phase 2 and told all ships to form up in hammer formation and execute maximum burn, and the Defiance's engines roared to full power, and humanity's main battle fleet dropped out of hyperspace directly behind the Dominion's capital ships. War leader Krathik stared at his tactical display in growing disbelief, because the humans had actually tricked him using tactics he had not seen employed in centuries, and his screening force was shattered and caught between two groups of enemy vessels, and now a third force had appeared behind his capital ships. His second-in-command was already issuing orders trying to reorganize the fleet, but Krathik interrupted and told him to focus all fire on the Defiance because he wanted that ship and its admiral dead, and he wanted to show these humans the price of cleverness. The Hammer of Obedience turned its massive weapons toward the approaching human flagship, and a dozen other Dominion capital ships did the same, and enough firepower to crack a continent focused on the Defiance, and they all fired at once. Marcus saw the energy reading spike across his board, and he screamed for evasive maneuvers and full countermeasures, and ordered all power redirected to forward shields, and the Defiance twisted and dove, while chaff and decoy drones scattered in her wake. The forward shields blazed to maximum strength, creating a shimmering barrier of bent space and electromagnetic force. But it was not enough because the first salvo hit like the hammer of an angry god, and the shields held for maybe half a second before collapsing completely. Secondary explosions rippled along the Defiance's hull as armor plating vaporized and entire sections went dark, and Marcus was thrown against his command chair hard enough to see stars, and alarms screamed throughout the bridge. He picked himself up and demanded a damage report, and Lauren was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but still barking orders, and she reported that shields were down, and they had hull breaches on multiple decks, and main power to portside weapons was gone, and engineering said the primary reactor was fluctuating badly. Marcus asked if they could still fly, and Lauren said yes, and he told her then they were still in the fight, and he ordered all weapons to target the Hammer and fire everything in a full spread because he wanted to see if they could rattle the mighty Dominion flagship. The Defiance fired nuclear-tipped missiles and railgun slugs and plasma torrents and experimental. The Hammer of Obedience shuddered under the sustained assault, and inside the massive flagship, Krathik felt his ship trembling in a way it never had before, and his tactical officer reported that shields were at 70% and dropping because the human weapons were primitive, but they fired faster than the shields could fully regenerate between hits. Krathik snarled and ordered all ships to form a defensive screen around the Hammer. But even as he gave the command, he realized he had made a critical error, because in focusing everything on protecting his flagship, he had forgotten about the 60 human ships that were still tearing through his disorganized screening force from behind. Commodore Lisa Grant saw the opportunity immediately from her command ship, and she told all Anvil ships to change target priority, because those Dominion capital ships were out of position trying to protect their flagship, and that meant they could be hit from behind where their shields were weakest. The human battle plan had never been designed to win through superior firepower, because humanity did not have superior firepower, and everyone knew it. But the plan had been designed to create chaos and break the Dominion's rigid tactical formations, and force them into a close-quarters brawl where faster, more maneuverable human ships could exploit every mistake. The Dominion was making mistakes now because they were accustomed to enemies who followed predictable patterns of surrender or defeat, and they had spent centuries fighting opponents who were already beaten in their own minds before the first shot was fired. The USS Ranger under Commander Paul Mitchell slipped through a gap in the Dominion formation and unleashed all its weapons at point-blank range into an enemy dreadnought's engineering section, and the Dominion ship's reactor went critical, and the explosion was so massive it took 2 nearby cruisers with it. The USS Phoenix, commanded by Captain Marie Torres, performed a maneuver that should have torn her ship apart as she dove under a Dominion battleship and raked its ventral surface with sustained plasma fire, and the enemy vessel lost all power and began drifting dead in space. All across the Titan Nebula, the battle devolved into a savage knife fight between fleets and ships grappled at ranges measured in kilometers rather than light seconds, and hulls collided, and reactor cores detonated, and men and women died by the thousands on both sides. But for every human ship that fell burning into the void, 2 Dominion vessels were crippled or destroyed because humanity's crews were not fighting for tribute or conquest or glory, but for survival, and there was no tactical doctrine in the galaxy that could fully account for that particular kind of desperation. Marcus watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction as the numbers shifted in humanity's favor, and the Dominion fleet that had arrived with such confidence was being torn apart by an enemy they had dismissed as primitive, and he felt a fierce pride in his people who refused to accept defeat. Nina reported that the Hammer was pulling back and trying to disengage, and that the entire Dominion fleet was attempting to withdraw from the battle, and Marcus told her not to let them and ordered all ships into pursuit formation, because they needed to end this here and now. The Hammer of Obedience was limping away with its shields at critical levels, and half its weapons offline, and the legendary ship that had broken civilizations was running from an upstart species that should have been an easy conquest. And Marcus knew this moment would echo through the galaxy for centuries. Lauren said quietly that one more push would finish them, and Marcus nodded and told the helmsman to set an intercept course and ordered weapons to prepare the Nova missiles, which were humanity's newest and most experimental weapons. Each Nova missile carried an antimatter warhead with the destructive power of a small star, going supernova, and the Defiance carried 6 of them, and they had never been used in combat before. But Marcus figured if there was ever a time to test new weapons, this was it. Jack confirmed target lock and firing solution, and Marcus gave the order, and 6 missiles screamed across the void, accelerating to relativistic speeds, and the Hammer's point defenses were degraded but not completely gone, and they managed to intercept 4 of the missiles, but not the other 2, and the warheads detonated simultaneously against the Hammer's failing shields, and for a moment, a miniature sun bloomed in the heart of the Titan Nebula, and when the light faded, the Hammer of Obedience was still there, but barely. The flagship's shields were completely gone, and its hull was buckled and torn in a dozen places, and it was venting atmosphere and debris, and emergency beacons were screaming across all frequencies, and the mighty ship that had terrified the galaxy for centuries was dying. Nina said with surprise in her voice that they were receiving an incoming transmission from the Hammer, and Marcus told her to put it on screen, and War Leader Krethix appeared again, but this time his exoskeleton was cracked, and green blood leaked from several wounds. Behind Krethix, his bridge was a scene of chaos with fires burning and crew members working frantically to save their ship, but his 4 eyes were still clear and focused as he looked directly at Marcus. Krethix spoke slowly and said that he had underestimated Marcus and underestimated humanity, and that this was not something that had happened to him before in his long career, and there was something in his voice that might have been respect. Marcus told him he was listening, and Krethix said that humanity had won this day, and his fleet was broken, and the Hammer itself would not survive another engagement, and he could order his remaining ships to fight to the death, but that would be a waste. Krethix explained that the Dominion must learn what happened here, and they must know that humans cannot be conquered through simple intimidation, and so he was withdrawing what remained of his fleet, and he would inform the Dominion Council that humanity was not to be interfered with. Marcus glanced at Lauren, who nodded slightly, and he told Krethix that was acceptable, but he needed to understand that if the Dominion returned, humanity would be ready, and next time, they would not be merciful. Krethix's mandibles clicked, and he said mercy was an interesting word to use while standing in the wreckage of his fleet, but he understood the meaning, and the transmission ended, and the remaining Dominion ships, less than half of what had arrived, began limping toward the edge of the nebula. A cheer erupted across the bridge of the Defiance, and Nina was hugging Jack, and Kyle was laughing in disbelief, and Lauren just stood there with tears streaming down her face because they had actually done it and won against impossible odds. Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction before raising his hand for silence, and he asked for a status report and wanted to know how many ships they had lost, and the celebrations quieted immediately. Lauren consulted her console, and her voice was subdued as she reported 87 ships destroyed, and another 43 damaged beyond immediate repair, and casualties were still being compiled. But preliminary estimates were over 30,000 dead. The price of victory settled on Marcus like a heavy weight, and he thought about 30,000 lives spent to earn humanity's freedom, and it could have been worse and should have been worse. But each one of those deaths was on him as the commander. He told Nina quietly to get him a channel to Fleet Command on Earth, and within moments Admiral Richard Cole appeared on screen, and behind him the Joint Chiefs were all standing, and when they saw Marcus alive, they broke into smiles. Richard asked for a report, and Marcus told him the Dominion fleet had been defeated and was withdrawing, and humanity's sovereignty was secure, and for a moment there was complete silence in the war room back on Earth. Then Richard asked about casualties, and Marcus gave him the numbers, and watched the smiles fade as the reality of what victory had cost sank in. But Richard nodded slowly and said that 30,000 had given their lives so that billions could remain free. President Carter appeared on the channel, and she looked exhausted but relieved, and she told Marcus that he and his fleet had done something incredible, and that humanity owed them a debt that could never be repaid, and she asked what he needed. Marcus looked around his battered bridge and saw his crew working to repair damaged systems and treat wounded personnel, and he thought about the 87 ships that would never come home, and the families who would receive notification that their loved ones had died in the black. He told the president that what he needed was for the politicians to make sure this sacrifice meant something, and to build a future worthy of the people who had given everything to defend it, and Carter promised him that humanity would not waste this chance. The channel closed, and Marcus sat down heavily in his command chair and felt every year of his age, and Lauren came over and put a hand on his shoulder and told him they had done good work today. Marcus nodded, but could not shake the images of burning ships and dying crews from his mind, and he wondered if the other species across the galaxy understood what humanity had just proven, and whether this victory would bring peace or just more conflict. The Defiance began the long journey back to Earth along with the surviving ships of the fleet, and behind them the Titan Nebula was filled with debris and bodies, and the ghosts of those who had fought and died to answer a simple question. Would humanity bow down, or would they fight back? And now the galaxy knew the answer, and Marcus hoped that answer would be enough to keep the wolves at bay, because he did not know if humanity could. The news of humanity's victory spread across the galaxy like wildfire, jumping from star system to star system, through trade routes and diplomatic channels and quantum communication networks, and at first, nobody believed it, because the idea of the Crethon Dominion being defeated was simply impossible. The Dominion had ruled for 3,000 years and crushed every challenge to their authority, and the Hammer of Obedience was legendary across hundreds of worlds, as the ship that ended wars before they could truly begin, and now humans claimed they had beaten it. The other species thought it must be propaganda, or misinformation, or some elaborate hoax designed to boost human morale before their inevitable extinction, and the betting pools on various worlds gave humanity less than a week before the Dominion returned with overwhelming force. Then the survivors of the subjugation fleet limped home, and they arrived at Crethon space with their ships battered and broken, and nearly half their vessels missing, and the Hammer of Obedience itself barely made it back before its damaged reactors would have failed completely. War leader Crethix filed his official report with the Dominion Council and confirmed that yes, humanity had indeed achieved what seemed impossible, and they had used tactics and determination that had not been seen in the galaxy for centuries, and they had earned their freedom through blood and fire. The Dominion Council sat in stunned silence as they read the report and reviewed the battle data, and watched the sensor recordings of human ships dancing through the nebula and striking with precision and ferocity, and they saw the Hammer's shields fail under sustained bombardment. For the first time in 800 years, the Crethon Dominion faced a species that had looked at their mighty fleet and said no, and backed up that defiance with victory, and the implications were staggering, because if one species could refuse, then others might find courage too. On the Vexlari homeworld, the news was received with a mixture of awe and hope, because the Vexlari had been paying tribute to the Dominion for 1,200 years, and they had watched their resources drain away generation after generation, but they had never imagined resistance was possible. The Vexlari Council held an emergency session and debated through the night about what humanity's victory meant for them. and whether they too could find the strength to refuse the next time the Dominion demanded tribute. And the younger council members spoke passionately about freedom while the elders cautioned patience. The Palaxian Empire, which had cut diplomatic ties with humanity, immediately after the defiance was now scrambling to re-establish contact, because they realized that humanity was not going to be destroyed, and might actually become a major power in the galaxy. Ambassador Chen received a message from the Palaxian foreign minister, apologizing for the hasty severance of relations, and explaining that they had simply been trying to protect their own people, and asking if perhaps trade negotiations could resume. Marcus read the message on the Defiance as the fleet made its way back to Earth, and he showed it to Lauren, who snorted and said the Palaxians were like rats jumping from a sinking ship, except they had jumped too early, and now wanted back on. 36 smaller species that had suffered under the Dominion's rule for centuries sent messages to Earth asking questions about human tactics and weapons, and whether humanity would be willing to share their knowledge or perhaps offer protection to others who might want to resist. President Carter met with her advisors and discussed how to respond to these requests, because humanity had never intended to become a galactic power broker. But suddenly, dozens of species were looking to them for leadership and guidance. Marcus received orders to proceed to Terminus Prime, which was a neutral world, where the Galactic Council held its assemblies, and he was to represent humanity at an emergency session called to discuss the new balance of power. 6 weeks after the Battle of Titan Nebula, Marcus stood in the assembly hall wearing his dress uniform with his medals, and he looked out at representatives from 200 species, all watching him with different expressions on their alien faces. Some looked at him with respect because they understood that what humanity had done took incredible courage, and others looked at him with fear, because a species willing to fight the Dominion might be dangerous in other ways too. The Crethon ambassador was an old counselor named Threxus who had served in the diplomatic corps for centuries, and he stood slowly and spoke in a formal tone as he acknowledged humanity's martial prowess and said the Dominion had no desire for further conflict. It was the closest thing to an apology the galaxy had heard from the Dominion in 3,000 years, and the other species in the assembly hall stirred with surprise because the mighty Crethon were actually backing down from a confrontation. But what surprised Marcus most was the reaction from the smaller species, because after the formal session ended, the Vexlari ambassador approached with his tentacles quivering and asked if humanity would be willing to extend protection to other species who shared their values. Marcus told him gently that humanity was not looking to build an empire because they had just fought a war to avoid being part of someone else's empire, but they were happy to sign mutual defense treaties with species that believed in freedom. More ambassadors came forward, and the Palaxians, who had been so quick to abandon humanity, now wanted trade agreements and technology exchanges, and the Cerelian Collective wanted to study human tactical doctrine and send their officers to train with human fleet commanders. 36 minor species that had lived under the Dominion's shadow wanted to know humanity's secret and how they had found the courage to fight, and Marcus tried to explain that it was not really complicated. He told them that humanity had fought because they refused to accept that losing was inevitable, and they had fought smarter and meaner and with more desperation than anyone else, and they had not been weighed down by centuries of military tradition that told them certain things were impossible. The ambassadors listened carefully, and some understood immediately, while others struggled to grasp the concept because they had spent so long being afraid that they had forgotten what it felt like to be angry. Marcus spent 3 days at Terminus Prime, meeting with various delegations and negotiating the framework for what would become the Free Species Alliance, which was not a military organization, but rather a coalition of worlds that agreed to support each other against aggression. The Dominion watched these developments with growing concern because they could see their grip on the galaxy weakening as more species found courage in humanity's example. And while the Crethon were still the most powerful military force, they were no longer the only force that mattered. On the 4th day, Marcus received permission to return to Earth, and the Defiance made the jump to hyperspace and crossed the light years between Terminus Prime and humanity's home system in 3 days. Earth looked beautiful from orbit, blue and white and green, and Marcus felt something tight in his chest loosen as he looked down at the world that had given birth to his species, because this was what they had fought for. The fleet was greeted with parades and celebrations, and Marcus and his senior officers were summoned to Geneva, where the world government had prepared a formal ceremony to honor those who had fought and died at Titan Nebula. President Carter presented Marcus with humanity's highest military decoration and gave similar honors to Lauren and Jack and Nina and Kyle and all the other officers who had served with distinction. And then she called for a moment of silence for the 30,000 who had not come home. The crowd of millions stood silent, and Marcus thought about all those empty chairs and missing faces, and he wondered if they would think the price had been worth it, and he hoped they would because humanity was free now. After the ceremony, Marcus met privately with President Carter and Admiral Richard Cole, and they discussed the future because humanity could not simply go back to the way things were before. Carter explained that the Free Species Alliance was growing faster than anyone expected, and 12 species had already signed the Mutual Defense Treaty, and another 20 were considering it, and humanity was at the center of something much larger than they had planned. Richard said the fleet was being expanded with 300 new ships under construction, and other species were offering to share technology in exchange for tactical training, and within 5 years humanity would have one of the most powerful fleets in the galaxy. Marcus listened to all this and felt the weight of responsibility, because humanity had kicked down the door, and now they had to deal with the consequences, and he was not sure if they were ready. Carter asked him what he thought they should do, and Marcus was quiet for a long moment before answering, and he told her they needed to remember why they fought. He said they fought for freedom and the right to make their own choices and to live without fear, and those principles needed to guide everything they did going forward, because if they lost sight of that, they would become just another empire. Carter nodded and promised that humanity would try to be worthy of the sacrifice made at Titan Nebula, and Marcus accepted that promise, knowing it was the best anyone could offer. 3 months after the battle, Marcus requested and received permission to return to active duty, and the Defiance had been repaired and upgraded with new shields and weapons systems, and some of the technology came from Grateful. The Defiance launched from Earth Space Dock 6 months to the day after the Battle of Titan Nebula, and Marcus stood on the bridge watching his homeworld fall away behind them as the ship accelerated toward the outer system, and he felt a strange mixture of pride and uncertainty about what lay ahead. Their mission was to patrol the frontier and protect the growing number of colony worlds and ensure that humanity's hard-won freedom remained secure, but Marcus knew it was more than that, because humanity had become a symbol to the entire galaxy of what was possible when someone refused to give up. Lauren's voice came over the communications channel from the USS Liberty, which was flying in formation beside them, and she asked what they were supposed to do now that they had already beaten the biggest bully in the galaxy, and everything else would seem boring by comparison. Marcus smiled and told her that now they had to make sure what they built here lasted, and they needed to show the galaxy that it was possible to be strong without being cruel, and that power did not have to come with tyranny attached. The fleet consisted of 40 ships including the Defiance, and they were heading toward the outer rim where several new colonies had been established, and there had been reports of pirate activity and requests for protection from smaller species who lived in that region. Kyle reported that they would reach the first colony in 4 days at current speed, and Nina added that they had received more diplomatic requests from species wanting to join the Free Species Alliance and asking for meetings with human representatives. Jack was reviewing tactical reports from scout ships, and he noted that while the Dominion had pulled back from human space, they were reinforcing their borders and increasing patrols in other sectors as if preparing for something. Marcus studied the strategic map and saw the pattern because the Dominion was not going to simply accept defeat and fade away, but they were also not ready to challenge humanity directly again, so they were consolidating their power and waiting. The question was what they were waiting for, and Marcus suspected they were hoping humanity would make a mistake or become complacent, or that the Free Species Alliance would fall apart through internal disputes. The Defiance dropped out of hyperspace near the colony world of New Terra, and Marcus was pleased to see that the settlement was thriving with orbital stations and surface cities and ships moving between the planet and nearby mining operations. The colonial governor came aboard and thanked Marcus personally for everything the fleet had done, and explained that knowing humanity could defend itself had given the colonists courage to expand and build and plan for the future, instead of just surviving day to day. Marcus toured the colony and met families who had children born among the stars, and saw schools and hospitals and parks and all the normal things that people built when they felt safe, and he realized this was what they had fought for. The patrol continued from world to world, and at each stop Marcus saw the same thing, which was people building lives and making plans and dreaming about tomorrow, because they were not afraid anymore. They encountered pirates near the fourth colony, and it was a small fleet of raiders who had been preying on merchant ships, but they scattered as soon as they saw the Defiance and her escorts, because nobody wanted to fight the ships that had beaten the Dominion. Lauren suggested they pursue and destroy the pirates, but Marcus ordered them to just secure the trade routes and protect the merchants, because humanity was not going to become the galaxy's police force unless absolutely necessary. 3 months into the patrol, they received a distress call from a Vexlari colony that was under attack by Crethon raiders, and the message said that Dominion ships were demanding tribute and threatening bombardment if the colony refused. Marcus ordered maximum speed to the Vexlari system, and the entire human fleet jumped to hyperspace and crossed the distance in 6 hours. And when they arrived, they found 3 Dominion cruisers in orbit around the colony world. The Crethon ships immediately powered up their weapons when they detected the human fleet, but Marcus ordered Nina to open a channel, and he told the Dominion commander that this colony was under the protection of the Free Species Alliance. The Crethon commander was a young officer who clearly remembered what happened at Titan Nebula, and he looked at the 40 human warships facing him and made the smart decision to withdraw without firing a shot. The Vexlari colonists were overjoyed, and their governor sent a message to the Vexlari homeworld reporting that humanity had driven off the Dominion with just their presence, and this news spread quickly through the Alliance. Over the next 6 months, similar incidents occurred in different parts of space, and each time Dominion forces found themselves facing human ships, they chose to withdraw rather than fight, and Marcus realized they were testing humanity's resolve and reach. President Carter called him back to Earth for a strategic meeting, and when Marcus arrived, he found the entire government in heated debate about humanity's role in the galaxy, because some wanted to expand protection to more worlds, while others worried about overextending. Marcus sat in the meeting room and listened to politicians argue about resources and commitments and strategic priorities, and finally, he asked for permission to speak. He told them that humanity had not fought at Titan Nebula to become rulers or protectors of the galaxy, but they had fought to prove that freedom was worth defending, and now other species were looking to them for leadership, whether they wanted it or not. He said the question was not whether humanity should help others, but rather what kind of species they wanted to be, and whether they would live up to the principles they claimed to value, or just protect themselves and let everyone else suffer. The room fell silent, and President Carter smiled and said that Marcus had a talent for cutting through political debate and getting to the heart of issues, and she asked what he recommended. Marcus suggested they continue expanding the Free Species Alliance, but make it clear that membership came with responsibilities, and that species who joined needed to contribute to their own defense, and not just rely on human protection. He said humanity should share tactical knowledge and help train other species' militaries and support them economically, but not fight their battles for them unless absolutely necessary, because that would just create dependency. The government agreed, and over the next year the Free Species Alliance grew to include 47 species, and established its own council and military coordination center and cultural exchange programs. The Dominion watched all this with growing unease because they could see a new power structure forming in the galaxy that did not answer to them, and while they were still the largest single military force, they were no longer the only force that mattered. 2 years after Titan Nebula, the Crethon Dominion sent an official diplomatic mission to Earth requesting formal negotiations, and Marcus was surprised when war leader Crethix himself led the delegation. Crethix had recovered from his wounds and stood before the human government with dignity and respect, and he acknowledged that the galaxy had changed and that the old ways of ruling through fear and intimidation were no longer sustainable. He proposed a formal peace treaty between the Dominion and humanity, with defined borders and mutual recognition, and a promise of non-aggression, and President Carter accepted after consulting with her advisors, and the treaty was signed on neutral ground at Terminus Prime. Marcus attended the signing ceremony and watched as 2 former enemies committed to peace, and he wondered how long it would last, but hoped it would be long enough for the younger generation to grow up without knowing war. The Defiance returned to patrol duty, and Marcus continued serving as humanity's presence on the frontier. But now the mission felt different because they were not just defending, but building something new. Lauren visited him one evening and they sat in his ready room drinking coffee and talking about old times. And she asked if he ever regretted defying the Dominion because they had lost so many good people. Marcus was quiet for a long time before answering, and he told her that regret was complicated because yes, he mourned every person who died, but he also believed the alternative would have been worse because living as slaves would have killed something essential in humanity's soul. She nodded and said she agreed, and then asked what he thought the future held, and Marcus looked out at the stars and said honestly that he did not know. He said the galaxy was changing faster than anyone expected, and humanity was at the center of that change, and there would be challenges and dangers they could not predict, but he believed humanity would face them the same way they faced the Dominion. 5 years after Titan Nebula, Marcus finally retired from active service at the age of 62 and handed command of the Defiance to his former tactical officer Jack, who had proven himself as capable and brave as any officer in the fleet. Marcus returned to Earth and accepted a position as an advisor to the government and spent his time teaching at the academy, where young officers came to learn about tactics and strategy and leadership. He told them stories about Titan Nebula and about the brave men and women who fought there, and he emphasized that their victory had not been about superior technology or numbers, but about refusing to accept defeat. He taught them that sometimes the greatest weapon was simple stubbornness and the willingness to fight for what was right, even when every logical analysis